Okay, welcome back. This is the Monday lecture on June 16th. We're into the final week of class. The final exam is here at the end of class, and I'm just trying to catch up on some recording some videos. And since no one is in this Zoom meeting with me, I will go ahead and just make it entirely about covering this one topic, unless someone does join me, in which case we might. Let's see, we might have, yeah, we got no one. If someone does join me, we might spend some time answering questions since we are so close to everything being due. Okay, so this lecture is wrapping up some of the lectures that didn't get covered in Unit 7, even though we are now on to kind of like, in terms of you should be watching videos for Unit 8 and Unit 9. Um, And for this particular lecture, it's on pictorial space. If you remember, we've already talked about space back in Unit 4 when we were talking about scale and space and scale relating to proportion and hierarchy and emphasis. And in that lecture, so we covered space a good deal, and we've kind of been mentioning space in a number of things. It also came up a lot when we were discussing form and discussing sculpture. But here we're talking about pictorial space, which is the various kinds of depictions and illusions of space in a two-dimensional image. And I make a little bit of the distinction between that because some are illusions in the sense that they're trying very, sometimes quite successfully, to kind of like create the feel of that space. So it seems very much like real space. And then others are more simply just the depictions of space, where it doesn't necessarily have to feel all that real like space. It just needs to make sure that we understand which things are close, which things are far back. So we're going to be in this lecture, we're going to be talking about perspective systems. And that's the core of this lecture. But the first thing that we're going to discuss is all the ways you can create space that don't involve using a perspective system. And we're going to create two-dimensional um, depicted space. But also, and then we're also going to spend some time talking about isometric perspective as well. So, but we'll get to all of that. Let's start with, so why were we discussing this in this unit with in Unit 7? In some ways, it would have made more sense to fit with Unit 5, where we talk about the Renaissance, but to a degree, a lot of things would make more sense to be. I couldn't load up, 1,000 different topics all related to the Renaissance. Um, and because of the, the unit on perspective, or because of the unit on printmaking, and we saw images like this image by Durer in the lecture on printmaking, it seemed like a good time for us to be talking about this issue. So, to begin with, there are lots of ways that you can create space that don't involve number 6, linear perspective. And by the way, that's not really what we have there. Not exactly a true linear perspective system, but it's close enough. Okay, so overlapping, right? Meaning, like, even if you don't change the scale of anything, even if you don't do anything else, if you simply show this thing overlaps like this shape or set of shapes, which therefore represent a thing, if these set of shapes represent a thing, overlap these set of shapes, overlap a different thing, then we believe that thing A is closer to us than thing B. Okay, so overlapping. Value, tone, um, creating lights and darks, chiaroscuro on a form, a sense of light and dark on forms. So basically, um, kind of modeling the form or shading is a way to make something automatically seem like it has space. Because if we can make ourselves believe in the objects as three-dimensional, then we have to believe in the space as being three-dimensional for those three-dimensional objects to exist in. Placement, or what is often called vertical positioning. In general, if all things are equal, if like the size of each of these circles, and they don't necessarily have to be circles, but if the size of each of them is is exactly the same, and the amount of value contrast on them is just about the same, and the way the values are working on them is just the same, and there's no overlapping, we still will generally believe that the ones closer to the bottom of the page are closer to us, and the ones closer to the top of the page are further away. That's called the vertical positioning. Okay. Scale, size, right? By making some shapes really large, we believe in them as being much closer to us, right? By making some shapes really small, we believe that they're much further away, especially like in this case, where it's using both change of scale and vertical positioning to do that. Okay. And then also like value contrast, decreasing value contrast. Um, can do that so that like if you have more value contrast for the objects that are up close and less value contrast for the objects that are further away, notice that there's a little bit of cheating in that the objects also get smaller, and that there's also overlapping going on there and vertical positioning going on there. But just simply um, using the amount of value contrast versus another thing having less value contrast can make the illusion of space. Okay. And then also this, not on this list right here, but I would also add to that the amount of attention and detail can can make a difference as well. So here's an example of work we have seen a number of times, and it's a really good example of a piece that doesn't not using any particular kind of perspective system, right? It's not a 1 point perspective, 2 point perspective. It's not an isometric perspective, although it does feel a little bit like isometric in that it does feel kind of upturned. Feels like our eye level is really high and that we're looking sort of down towards the ground plane. So in that way, it feels similar to an isometric. But there's really no perspective system here. And yet, it very believably creates a lot of space, primarily through overlapping, a little bit through scale change, but mostly through overlapping. Um, all right. So before we talk about linear perspective, we should also talk about isometric perspective. And one of the reasons, because it's a core, one of the things this class is about is how what we think we see and what we actually see are not the same thing. And so isometric perspective is a really good example of that, where to our eyes, it looks false, looks kind of artificial, it looks unnatural because parallel lines in an isometric system, parallel lines are represented as parallel. So therefore, things don't look like they're going back in space, and it makes planes look like they're more upturned. Everything seems kind of tilted up in an isometric space. But the important thing to remember is that isometric perspective is more accurate to the stuff, right? Like, let's look at this kind of isometric drawing for a second, and it'll give you a clear idea of what I mean by that. Like, imagine this is a piece of plastic that's part of a set that's going to build some Lego toy or something. Okay. And it's in your packet of instructions. You look at this drawing, and this drawing says that this height here is exactly the same as that height and exactly the same as that. And that's true in that you literally can take a ruler and measure this and measure that and measure that and measure that, and they're all exactly the same height. So then when you look at your block and you're like, oh, that's all the same across there, it matches, and you're like, this is true. The diagram is telling me. And it even, to a degree, tells you that this height here is some proportion. I'm guessing, let's see, 1, 2, 3. So that's 3 diamonds high. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So this is 3/5 the length of that. And then if we actually had the toy in front of us, we could look at it and be like, measure it and be like, yeah, it is. It's exactly 3/5 the measurement of that. Linear perspective is not true to the object because if we look at it, it tells us that this height for the back of the box is different from that height for the front of the box. Like if we measured it and measure this, we'd get two different measurements. It would say that the front corner of the box is taller than the back. Now we know what it means. We know that it's not saying that the box actually gets smaller in the sides and is taller in the corner that's coming towards us. What it's saying is that those back corners look smaller because they're further away, right? But it doesn't give us an exact system to measure it to figure out, well, what is that height? Like we have to go to this height to measure it and then hope and guess that this is exactly the same as that, right? Whereas in an isometric system, we know for certain that this height is always going to be exactly the same as that height. So, isometric perspective is more true to the object or to the world, to reality. Linear perspective, and it should say linear perspective right here, right? This should say linear perspective. That should say isometric perspective. Linear perspective is more true to the way we see the world, okay, to the perception of the world. And that's an important distinction to understand that how we see the world is not the same thing as how the world is. Okay. But learning how to describe the world the way we see it rather than the way it physically is was really key to the Renaissance in terms of for them being able to make artwork that they felt was really convincing and was really kind of achieving what they were aiming for. So the invention of perspective by Brunelleschi led to artists being able to apply that and in a one-point perspective system here, like with the Holy Trinity by Masaccio, be able to really kind of imagine how all of this architecture is going to go back in space, right? There's a one-point perspective system with the vanishing point right there. And if you look at Uccello right here, we can see how he's using the ground plane, the way he has all the weapons of war to fall so that they kind of line up in a grid system so that they're all going back in space in perspective. Um, it is kind of a magical realism to that, like everything falls and lands in perspective. But but anyway, he did that as a way to show that he understood the perspective system. Or here we have Mantegna and having to use a perspective system to help himself figure out how do we see like a person, how do we see a person lying flat, like if we're down at the feet. We have to figure out the perspective box that that whole body goes into. So besides one point perspective, that's one type of linear perspective. There's also something called two-point perspective, and this is an example of two-point perspective. And you can kind of tell the difference between the two because in one-point perspective, everything is straight going down, right? The vanishing point's generally roughly in front of us, and anything the rules are in one-point perspective, everything is a diagonal going to a single vanishing point or it's a perfect vertical or a perfect horizontal. So you notice in this drawing, every single diagonal is all going to that one single vanishing point. And anything else is either a perfect vertical or a perfect horizontal. Whereas in two-point perspective, everything goes to one vanishing point or to another vanishing point. And the only lines that aren't going to one vanishing point or to the other vanishing point, and so the other vanishing point is probably somewhere over about here. The only lines that are not going to one or the other vanishing point are the lines that are perfect verticals. Okay. There is also something called three-point perspective, but we're not going to have to worry about that today. So here are some examples of artwork we've already seen that that is a great example of perspective. In this case, the School of Athens is a fantastic example of one-point perspective. The vanishing point that like all of this architecture, pretty much all of the architecture, the entire space is built around. It's all going to a vanishing point that's roughly exactly halfway between the head of Aristotle and Plato, which is pretty cool. And so that includes these perspective lines are on the floor here. There is one exception. There's this box. It's a little bit catty-cornered. Now it could be there's a way to do this both in two-point perspective where he could have put a vanishing point over on both sides and kind of made it work that way. But there's also a way in one point perspective to draw boxes and planes and things that are tilted. But it is quite complicated. So either he put it in there just to prove that he could, who knows? Maybe he originally had a box that was lining up and he just felt like it seemed too forced. Here's another example. I don't think we've actually seen this image yet. We may have of this is from Thomas Eakins. This is a study for these paintings he did of the Schmidt brothers, who were both professional scullers, which is a type of rowing. And they're on their sculling boat here. And to figure out for this painting, he wanted to figure out how he could draw the little tiny ripple waves, but make sure that they were going back in perspective, that they were decreasing in size properly. And so what he did was he built a perspective system for the entire plane to figure that out. This is George Tooker, who is a more recent artist from the 50s and the 60s, and American artist. And he uses perspective in a very different kind of way, in an emotional and kind of psychological way, a more fantastical way. Here's Ed Ruscha. Ed Ruscha definitely, a lot of his pieces have nothing to do with perspective, but this particular he had a number of pieces that use this standard oil station as a motif, and all the ones that use that are very much working with a 2 point perspective space. And then here's Carla Klein, a contemporary artist who does have some similar things that she explores. It's subtle in Carla Klein, so sometimes it's almost like you can't quite figure out where the perspective system is, but it's in there. There's the space goes back in space in a perspective system. Sarah Morris makes paintings, various kinds of paintings, but some of the ones that she makes have this kind of like implication of perspective space. I think that she only does that for the paintings that she makes that are like kind of portraits of airports. I'm not sure why the portraits of airports, and and I think she kind of like she takes observations about colors that she sees, and then makes kind of like these perspective spaces, and then divides everything up into these flat colors. Julie Moretu also is a contemporary artist who very much plays with perspective space and just with illusions of space in a very abstract way. They don't feel like necessarily like we're looking at a painting of anything, and yet at the same time, we have a very strong sense that we're looking at space. Here's another one. I love this one. It's amazing. So monumental. And that's it. And I'm probably going to end this video here, and that's only 20 minutes. And I might actually just record another one for just so we get these out of the way. All right, thank you very much.